About 25 years ago, while I was still in middle school around 7th grade, I had this real bad problem with bullies. I couldn't handle the ridiculing I took while riding the school bus, so I started walking 3 miles to and from school every day. The path I walked was actually pretty safe. It was mostly on a sidewalk and always on a fairly busy road, with the last 2.5 miles being a straight shot directly to the school. Back then, there wasn't a stigma attached to kids being outside on their own. This wasn't deemed unsafe or noticed by anyone, or so I thought at least. I lived alone with my father, my parents being divorced. My mother saw me on the weekends. My father didn't see any harm in the walking, and my mother wasn't even aware of the bullying or the walking either. I didn't want her to know, actually. So I continued to do this unimpeded for over a half of the school year. I wasn't exactly an active kid. I for sure didn't like having to walk 6 miles every day to school, so I assumed that was the motivation for the error I was about to make. One day, on that long 6-mile way home, a car pulled up on the shoulder and stopped, just 100 feet ahead of me. Immediately I thought, hey, that car looks familiar. It must be my father. He's going to drive me the rest of the way today. That's great. I started to jog up to this car, seeing him in the driver's seat waiting patiently. And then I noticed something. Huh? His hair looks darker than normal today. Wait, wasn't the inside of his car tan, not red? The thoughts left as soon as they entered. I caught up to the car and opened the passenger side door and started to get in. As I was tossing my backpack on the floor in front of me and swinging my legs into the car, I started to say, "Thanks, Dad," but the sentence never finished. Before I knew it, I had shut the car door and begun to move. This isn't my father. The man was much older, by at least 20 years, hair obviously dyed black, and hands propped at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Even the shirt he was wearing looked just like the one my father would have worn, a short-sleeved collared button-down, brick red with black horizontal lines, not pressed but not too wrinkled either. He was smiling at me, which probably would have felt warm if it was coming from someone like my grandfather, but instead, this man's smile felt menacing. I heard a click and looked over at the door, which had just been locked. I stared at the door for a moment longer, then turned to face the front, completely frozen, terrified. What am I supposed to do now? "Hello. I saw you walking and I figured I'd come give you a lift." I didn't move or answer. Don't act scared, just act normal. His voice matched his smile, deceivingly friendly. We were roughly a mile away from my home, and only half a mile from the next turn needed to head that direction. All I could do was concentrate on exactly how I was going to get out of this situation. Stay calm, don't act scared. "Are you on your way home, perhaps?" This snapped me a little out of my zone. "Home, yes, I want to go home," I answered. Stay calm, talk normally, don't act scared. I repeated these to myself. "Where's your house? I can take you there." Feeling just slightly relieved, I told him to take the next turn. I felt myself begin to breathe and realized how tense I had been. My body relaxed slightly, and I finally moved and wrapped my hands around my backpack straps. "See, things are fine. Keep calm and you'll get home just fine," I kept telling myself. We started to come upon the intersection. I pointed ahead, reiterating that this was my turn. "Okay, but if you want, we could take a ride instead." It sounded like a question, but it didn't feel like one. The dotted line for the turn lane had already begun, but he did not move over. I instantly tensed back up, and my grip and my gaze on the backpack straps tightened. Through strained muscles, I choked out that no, I really needed to get back home. He swung the car into the turn lane and began to make the turn. Wide-eyed, I glanced up and verified that, yes, we indeed were making the turn now. "Are you sure? I'll make sure you get home before anyone realizes you were gone." Grip tightening further, I abruptly stated that I needed to get home right now because my father was expecting me. He was already waiting. I hoped it sounded more convincing to him than it sounded to me. We completed the turn seamlessly. Okay, well, maybe next time. I'd like to meet you at the same place tomorrow if that's okay. Sure, yes, tomorrow. Tomorrow is good. Always tomorrow. Tomorrow is far away. I just need to get home today, right now. Maybe it was actually convincing the way I answered him. My eyes were firmly trained on the road ahead of us, hoping that if I just focused on the direction to home, I would get there without trouble. The turn into my neighborhood was fast approaching, and I informed him again, pointing to the direction straight home. The next moments were silent, even if everything was loud in my head. As we came upon the turn, I reminded him, and to my slight surprise and incredible relief, he actually made the turn. For the first time, I had more hope than doubt. Oh damn, I can't let him know where I live. What should I... You know, it's probably not a good idea that I drop you off right in front of your house. Your dad might see me, and get mad that a man gave you a ride home. Then we wouldn't be able to meet tomorrow. I was able to appreciate the good fortune of my silent question immediately being answered for me. My old neighborhood consisted of mainly apartments, but in the back there were a block of townhouses, which is where I lived. If you were unaware of the layout of the complex, those townhouses might go completely unnoticed. Right before we got to the area where I lived, I told him to stop right there. He pulled over to the side of the road in front of an apartment building. He unlocked the car door and I hurried out, backpack still clutched firmly in hand. I began to close the car door behind me. I'll see you here tomorrow then? Same time? I paused for a second and risked another look at the man. Still smiling, still terrifying. Yeah, tomorrow. See you later. I finished closing the door and hurried off. I tried my best not to run. I swung my backpack on the right way and briskly walked in the opposite direction of my house. I could hear the car idling behind me. It wasn't until I was able to turn off that road and leave his view that I finally heard him start to move away. He had to drive up to where I was walking to turn around. I glanced back as he was making an awkward turn instead of going around the block to leave. He caught my gaze and gave a slight wave before driving off. My hand was in the reluctant process of waving back, but I was slow enough that he was gone before I even completed the motion. I turned my head and kept walking. The moment I could no longer hear his car, I ran as fast as my pudgy legs and heavy backpack would let me. I ran around to where I could hide between two buildings and stayed there for a while, until I felt enough time had passed for me to feel confident he was not just driving around waiting to look for me. It was probably 30 minutes, but it felt like hours at the time. I ran the rest of the way home, keeping a lookout and making sure he couldn't see me going through the backyards. I reached my front door, unlocked it, and almost spilled inside. I was moving so fast. It wasn't until I locked the door behind me that I finally felt safe. I didn't feel scared anymore. I was finally home, and I couldn't believe I'd made it. In the end, I told both of my parents. My mother forced my father to drive and pick me up from school for the remainder of the school year, and luckily for me, the bullying stopped next year as well. My father didn't believe me though, and thought I made up the story to get out of walking to school. In his defense, me trying to explain that no, the car was exactly like yours, and no, he did look like you, just with darker hair, was kind of unbelievable. It didn't matter really. It was worth his disbelief and annoyance every day in the car, so I never had to meet with that guy ever again. This happened back when I was in 4th grade. It's always stuck out to me as odd, but once I became an adult, it dawned on me just how dangerous this really was. I had just been invited to a friend's birthday party, which was to be held at a popular pizza joint that had a bunch of arcade games and things like that. This pizza place was right next door to a small movie theater. The movie Titanic had just come out, so there was a decent amount of people in this part of the shopping center. My mom had to run some errands and pick up one of my other brothers, so she dropped me off along the way there. She said she was going to stay until others arrived for the party, but I knew she had a lot to do. The place was familiar to me as well, and I knew my friends were already either inside or would be there very shortly. I told her to just drop me off, and I went inside by myself. My mom had also arranged a ride home for me from one of my friend's parents. No one had gotten there yet, so I had to look around at all the different games. I then went outside the restaurant to wait for my friends to show up. There were actually a lot of people outside the theater, lined up and waiting to get an early entry for the evening showing of the Titanic. And that's when I noticed a couple, a guy and a girl, standing by a car smoking cigarettes and staring over at me. A good chunk of time had passed, about 20 minutes or so. I was super confused as to why my friends hadn't shown up yet. I knew for a fact that this was the right place, and I had showed up at the right time as well. I was going over all the reasons why they might be late when the cigarette-smoking couple came over to me and started to initiate a conversation. They asked me what or who I was waiting for. Now, obviously at first I was very hesitant to talk to these strangers, but they looked to be about my oldest brother's age, late teens or early 20s, so I wasn't feeling too bashful or shy around them, at least conversationally. I explained to them that I was waiting for my friends to show up for a group birthday party, but they hadn't shown up yet and they were all running pretty late. The couple made some other small talk, told me they were waiting to see Titanic, but when they showed up, all the tickets had already sold out for the showing they wanted. They just decided to hang out until the next showing, which they had successfully gotten tickets for. After a little while longer of waiting and talking with this couple, they asked if I was hungry. I said I was, and they offered to buy me some pizza to share. As a hungry kid who was seriously looking forward to pizza, but was unsure if the party was even still going to happen, it wasn't an offer I could afford to pass up. We went inside and ordered and sat down together. I actually ended up hanging out with this couple for a really long time. They were being super nice to me, gave me money for arcade games, bought me as much pizza and soda as I wanted. I had almost completely forgotten about my friends and the party that was supposed to happen, until I saw what time it was. Almost 2 hours had passed by. I started to get pretty nervous and anxious. I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to get home now. I didn't have a cell phone on me since it was 1997, and neither did my parents. My mom was going to be furious that A, no one had even showed up to the party, and B, that I didn't seek out help from the restaurant or some kind of security guard or police officer. Also C, I'd spent the last 2 hours with some strangers accepting food and money from them. I decided to ask this couple what I should do. This is where things started to get very strange. The guy just turned to me and said flatly, "You don't need to go home." Thinking back, I definitely couldn't comprehend the weight of what he'd just said. I didn't know what to say in response to this, so I just kind of shrugged in confusion. I told them I needed to find a phone. I went up to the counter and asked if they could help me. I called home, but nobody seemed to be able to answer. I tried again and again, but still nothing. I then told the people at the counter that I was trying to get picked up, but no one was answering the phone at home. I must have looked pretty panicked, because just then the guy from the couple came over and put his hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry, we'll figure this out together." He then gave me some more money to play a few more arcade games, while he figured it out with the guys behind the counter. I had no idea what they talked about specifically, but I ended up playing another game, then went back to the table we were at. The guy came back over and said that now they were going to take me home. He was being super positive and upbeat about it as well, insisting it was no trouble whatsoever. His girlfriend was also being very insistent of the idea. A part of me was still super hesitant, because I was taught stranger danger and all of that. But the bigger part of me wanted to believe it was really all innocent. I was really grateful after all that these people had been so nice to me, fed me and kept me entertained. They had even missed their movie to stay with me. I told them I wanted to try calling home a few more times before leaving. So over the next 15 to 30 minutes, I tried calling everyone a bunch, but there were no answers at all. I decided it would be best to say yes to these people and have them take me home. Again, I was very young, impressionable, and naive, and had never been in a situation like that before. The people behind the counter, though, must have been seeing this from the more rational side. They realized something seriously fishy was going on. It turned out, in the meantime, one of them had gone on break to go call the police to come over and address the situation. The policeman showed up and came over to figure out what was going on. I don't remember everything about the conversation, but it ended up coming down to who was going to take me home. The couple was being oddly insistent. Thinking about this now as an adult, I find it kind of strange that the cop was even considering letting this whole thing be an option. As an adult, there's no question in my mind the cop should have shut that conversation down immediately and taken me home himself. But for some reason, they as a group decided to let me decide. I felt like I was being extremely pressured. I remember going back and forth in my mind. These people had been so nice to me and had hung out with me all day. I didn't want to be rude, but I also felt really intimidated by the police officer. I remember this part specifically as if it were yesterday. As I was thinking over what to do, the cop left to talk to some of the guys behind the counter. Immediately, as soon as he was away, the man from the couple looked at me with this big, broad smile and asked me this: "Do you want to go with him, or do you want to go with us?" I told him I would go with them in that moment. Again, in hindsight, I can't believe the cop let this happen. As we were getting our things to go, the police officer suggested that if they were going to take me home, he was going to follow us the entire way there, which I guess was a redemptive assurance. The officer asked for my address and my parents' names as well, just to be sure. I got in the couple's car and told them where I lived. We started on our way. The girl was driving and the guy was in the front passenger seat. The entire drive there, the guy was just looking over his shoulder out the back window, glancing back and forth between me and the cop following us. We pulled up to my house and I went up to the front door, while both the couple and the cop parked out on the street. I opened the door and went inside, and saw my mom looking out the window with a very confused and concerned look on her face. She went outside, found out all that had happened, and was immediately furious. I didn't tell her the specific things the couple had said to me. Again, I really didn't understand the gravity of the situation until years later. Going through the whole scenario in my head, if the cop hadn't followed us, I more than likely would have never been seen again. Thinking all the things they had done and said, befriending me, feeding me, giving me money, this was obviously them totally trying to come across as disarming, trusting, and friendly. A totally fucked up situation that could have been so much worse. It's really kind of hard to think about. I'm almost 30 now and have kids of my own, and thinking about them in this situation makes my blood boil over. Also, the reason why my friends never showed up and the party never happened was because they had to cancel for an emergency in the last minute, and they weren't able to call to let me know. So there's that, I guess. This is a true story about my life that began roughly 4 years ago when I just turned 16. I've been weighing on whether or not I should post this even, because I'm a little afraid the person in this story will somehow see it and know it's me writing about them. Nevertheless, here I am. The minute I turned 16, I knew I wanted to get a job. The first one I was able to get was a restaurant job. It wasn't exactly fast food, but it also wasn't a full-service restaurant. It was somewhere in between the two. I was a cashier and was actually very, very, very shy. This is important to note, as some things that I'll talk about later continually happened because of how I was resistant in speaking up. Now, I'd say I was about halfway through my first year or so at the restaurant when Chris was first hired. My first impression of him was that he was extremely tall, extremely loud, and kind of a charismatic teddy bear type person. This was also the impression he gave the rest of the staff as well, and the impression that remained with them the entire time he worked there. Honestly, I don't fully remember the first encounter I had with him. Again, I was very shy and I just really wanted to do my job in peace. All I really recall is that my manager was talking with him and introduced me as one of the only high schoolers on the staff, and someone she thought was quite funny. I remember him saying something about how he was going to make me tell him a few jokes to see, but I don't remember anything after that. In the beginning, it just seemed like he was suddenly so stuck to me. What I do remember, though, is the hugs. Chris was certainly a big hugger. He liked to hug every girl on the staff when he first arrived, and also when he was about to leave. I would feel very uncomfortable by this, because not only did I hate being touched by a man I didn't know, but he was also a man nearing 30 years old. Whenever he would come over to me, I would always find myself something to busy myself with in a corner, so he couldn't easily touch me. When he did end up catching me off guard and getting me into a hug, he would really linger and rub my lower back. No one else around me seemed to care or be uncomfortable by the constant hugs, though. This was a large factor in me feeling like I was overreacting. There was a time I went in on my day off to put a request off in the office. I talked with one of my managers in the front for a few minutes, when suddenly she heard someone talking over the headset to her. She looked over at me and smiled. "Chris sees you and wants you to wait until he's finished in the back so he can give you a big hug." I couldn't control my grimace and told her I was going to leave right away. She laughed, and I heard her say over the headset how I was running away as I walked out the door. For the next couple of weeks, Chris refused to speak to me, but I could feel him staring all the time. It was at least a nice break from all the hug attempts. Eventually, he got over it though, and continued like nothing had ever happened. Another particular hug I remember is when we were both alone in the back. I had walked back there to retrieve something, and Chris was the only other person there. Usually, the dishwashers or the manager or another server would be there too. It almost made me stumble a step, and I briefly hesitated. He'd always made me nervous to talk to with others around, and now that we were alone, I knew he would start some sort of conversation inevitably. He saw me stumble and laughed and told me to come in. The entire conversation is a bit of a blur, but I remember him asking me how I was feeling that day. I responded with some sort of dumb joke like, "Oh, you know, good, kinda dead inside." I thought he would laugh it off and we would just move on. Instead, he immediately went in for a hug. I maneuvered as best as I could into a side hug and patted his back. As I did, I felt his other hand press against my lower stomach and slowly start rubbing in a circle. He leaned down into my ear and whispered, "It's okay. Chris will make it all better." I remember going white in the face and fake laughing, backing right out of there. The entire exchange took less than 15 seconds, but it completely destroyed my mood for the rest of my shift. Although this was definitely the most inappropriate interaction I'd had with him so far, I still did not say a thing to anyone. The next thing I remember is the singing. Chris was, I believe, around 28 years old and also a college dropout. His dream was to become a famous singer. He would always sing to customers, in the back kitchen and dish room. He most definitely sang to me. He'd make up songs about this high school girl and walk back and forth by my station singing at what seemed like an insane volume. I would always cringe into my register and try to talk over his voice to the customers. I think the songs were when I really understood that although he was very touchy with everyone else, he seemed especially interested in me. Every time we worked a shift together or even saw each other, I say this as he was always in the restaurant even when he wasn't working. Seriously, every day it was like he lived there. He would ask me to come over to his apartment after work. He would talk about how he wanted to show me some new thing he put in or just bought, or how he was going to throw a game night with the rest of the staff. He would also seem very upset when I said I couldn't because of school in the morning, or that my mom didn't want me to, as the rest of the staff were already college-age students. There's even one time in particular I remember where I went to IHOP with the rest of the staff after a shift, because it was the first time I had ever worked up the courage and felt comfortable enough to hang out with them outside of work. Chris was there, but I barely spoke with him and sat on the other side of the table. When I got up to use the bathroom and walked out after I was finished, Chris was there waiting for me. I think he had pretended to need to go to the bathroom also, but had waited until I walked out. It was nearing when we were leaving. He grabbed my arm and asked if I would ride with him back to the restaurant, where the rest of our cars were, instead of who I'd come with. I quickly brushed past him and jokingly said I thought my coworker might be offended by that. I ran back to our table before he could respond. Although all of these things made me very uncomfortable, I didn't truly feel a bit of fear until movie night. This happened quite later into my time at the restaurant, after I had made a couple of actual friends there. 2 girls that were around my age and I had become fairly close at this point, and decided that after their shifts on Friday night, I would come pick them up and we'd go see a movie at the mall close by. We laughed and talked and generally had a really good time together. I remember really enjoying the movie all the way through to the end. However, when it did end and we all filed out, one of them looked briefly behind her, then stopped in her tracks. We both whipped our heads around immediately when she called out in a confused voice, "Chris?" It was then when I saw him, kind of embarrassed and half hiding behind the staircase. He walked over and laughed. "Wow, it's so crazy, you guys are here too." We then told him to wait a minute while we had to go to the bathroom. After rushing in, we looked at each other with the widest eyes. I started stumbling with my words, and then they filled me in. They said he had been there during their shift earlier, and overheard them talking about how I was going to pick them up for a movie. He asked which movie, and they told him. They said he didn't even say anything else. They might have been lying, I guess, but it really would not take a genius to figure out the location and time if he knew which movie it was, although I could tell it weirded them out a bit. I was by far the most uncomfortable. They tried to calm me down by saying things like, "Oh, you know, he just has a little crush on you. He probably just knew you were going to be there and wanted to come see you." This did not calm me down at all, though. They ended up deciding to go to McDonald's together afterwards. I faked that I wasn't feeling good and just had him take them while I went home. I'm sure I didn't fool anyone, though. I remember seeing his car everywhere I went, even though I knew he lived in the next town over. It was a car I remember very well, as whenever I had a shift, I would always check the parking lot to see if it was there to prepare myself. Although I don't want to say exactly how, it was definitely very distinct and identifiable. I saw it rushing past me at the mall. I would see it outside of my local grocery store. I would even see it briefly slowly leaving my neighborhood. Every time I felt this rush of anxiety, but again, I never said a thing to anyone. One of the final things that happened when he still worked there was at my high school graduation. As I said before, I was the only one of the high school students out of a staff of about 40 people. Definitely the only high schooler at my specific school, to be sure. I was close to a select few at my work, but not close enough that I thought anyone should come or be invited to my graduation, especially because it was over an hour away, and that's a lot to just randomly ask of someone. The only people that knew where and when it was were the friends that were graduating with me and my family. The afternoon went on, and I had a fairly great time. After the ceremony was over, everyone was to leave the building and find their friends and family outside in the lot. We were arranged by last name, so I had to wander a bit while calling my mom in order for us to find each other. That was when I saw Chris. He was leaning against the side of the building, looking around intensely. Although he could have possibly been there for someone else, I knew in my heart he was looking for me. I quickly walked back into the middle of the crowd and told my mom to meet me in the complete opposite direction. We eventually found each other and took a few pictures. Then I begged them to leave right away. I remember them being a bit surprised, but they chalked it up to me being tired from waking up early that morning. When I had a shift later that week, Chris came up to me and told me he had something to say. He revealed he had found out online where and when my graduation was and had planned to surprise me. He was sad he never found me, but he wanted to give me something. He handed me this envelope with a thick card inside and told me to open it later. I wish I could tell you what it said, but I was too scared to ever open it. I put it in my car and I either threw it out or it was just lost. I can't really remember. Kind of a boring ending, but Chris continued to talk to me, and I would see his car around everywhere a few more times. But nothing else super intense happened after that. He was fired for no showing a couple of times, and I eventually moved out of state for college, so there was really no opportunity for it to happen. I never saw him again, and I am grateful for that. There were many more little things he did throughout the years we both worked there, but then this story would be insanely long. I can't even begin to remember all of them anyway. I think I didn't ever say anything for a couple of reasons. First, I was shy and thought I was overreacting, especially because no one else somehow seemed to think it was any weird how he acted. In fact, everyone really liked him and thought he was very cool. Second, he didn't really behave like the stalkers you see in a movie, at least personality-wise. He was very direct in wanting my attention, or wanting to be near me, and didn't ever hide that in front of other people. He came over immediately when we called him out in the movies, and he was very honest about going to my graduation after the fact. Obviously, I see everything crystal clear now, but it's almost as if I didn't say anything, because I really didn't want to believe what I was seeing either. Update. I doubt anyone will even see this, but an old co-worker of mine contacted me earlier this week and let me know that Chris is actually in prison right now. He's in a state about halfway across the country, convicted for sexual assault.